The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Street as 30 excited third-graders chattered loudly aboard the yellow school bus, their faces pressed against windows, still fogged with their breath. They were returning from what had been the most amazing field trip of their young lives at the Natural Science Museum, their backpacks stuffed with dinosaur stickers and their minds buzzing with stories of ancient creatures and volcanic eruptions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. None of them noticed that David Park, their 52-year-old bus driver, had begun sweating profusely despite the cool October air. None of them saw how his left hand had started trembling as he gripped the steering wheel tighter, fighting against a crushing pain that was spreading across his chest like wildfire. The bus was navigating through Springfield Valley's busiest intersection when David felt the world begin to tilt. The pain in his chest exploded into something so intense that his vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment he couldn't remember where he was or why 30 young voices were suddenly screaming behind him. His foot slipped off the brake pedal as his body convulsed, and the massive vehicle began drifting toward the concrete barrier that separated the road from a 40-foot drop into the Springfield River below. Rachel Torres had just finished the most exhausting 12-hour shift of her nursing career at Mercy General Hospital. Her feet ached in her worn sneakers, her scrubs were stained with coffee and other unmentionable substances, and all she wanted was to drive home to her small apartment and collapse on her couch with a cup of tea. She was fumbling for her car, keys in the hospital parking lot, when she heard the screaming. Not the usual city noise that she had learned to tune out after 5 years of living in Springfield Valley, but the pure, terrified screams of children in mortal danger. Rachel's head snapped up just in time to see the school bus careening toward the guardrail, its yellow bulk swaying dangerously as it picked up speed. Without thinking, without calculating the risk to herself, without considering that she was off-duty and had no obligation to get involved, Rachel dropped her purse and sprinted toward the intersection. Her nursing instincts, honed by countless emergency situations, told her exactly what was happening even before she could see David. Park slumped over the steering wheel, his face gray and twisted in agony. The bus was less than 50 yards from the barrier when Rachel reached the passenger door. She pounded on the glass with both fists, shouting at the children to move away from the front as she yanked on the handle. The door was locked, but Rachel could see David's unconscious form behind the wheel, his body weight pressing against the accelerator as the bus continued its deadly trajectory toward the river. She had perhaps 30 seconds before 30 families would be destroyed forever. Rachel's mind raced through her options with the clinical precision that had made her one of the most respected emergency room nurses at Mercy General. She could run to safety and call for help, but by the time emergency services arrived, it would be too late. She could try to flag down other drivers, but the morning rush-hour traffic was too heavy and too fast for anyone to react in time. Or she could do what every fiber of her professional training and personal courage demanded. She could save those children herself, regardless of the consequences. The bus was now only 20 yards from the concrete barrier, and Rachel could hear the children's screams growing more desperate as they realized their vehicle was out of control. She grabbed a loose piece of concrete from a nearby construction site and smashed it against the bus door's glass panel. The safety glass cracked but held, so she struck it again and again until finally it gave way, sending sharp fragments cascading to the ground as she forced her way inside. David Park was in full cardiac arrest, his lips already turning blue as his heart struggled to pump blood to his vital organs. Rachel had seen this condition hundreds of times in the emergency room, but never while standing in a moving vehicle that was seconds away from plunging into a river with 30 terrified children aboard. She pushed David's unconscious body away from the controls and slammed her foot on the brake pedal just as the front wheels touched the concrete barrier. The bus shuddered to a halt with only inches to spare, its front bumper scraping against the guardrail as Rachel fought to control the massive vehicle. Behind her, 30 children sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with shock as they realized how close they had come to disaster. But Rachel's work was far from over. David Park was dying, and she was the only person who could save him. Rachel had performed CPR countless times in the controlled environment of a hospital emergency room, surrounded by state-of-the-art equipment and a full medical team. But performing chest compressions on a middle-aged man in the driver's seat of a school bus with 30 traumatized children watching her every move was unlike anything she had ever experienced. She positioned her hands on David's sternum and began the rhythmic compressions that might restart his heart, counting aloud, to keep herself focused while simultaneously trying to reassure the frightened children behind her. The first 2 minutes of CPR yielded nothing. David's skin remained grey, his pulse absent, his breathing non-existent. Rachel could feel the children's eyes on her as she worked, their terrified whispers creating a soundtrack of desperation that threatened to break her concentration. She had to succeed. These children had already been through enough trauma for one day, and watching their bus driver die in front of them would scar them for life. Rachel adjusted her position and continued the compressions with renewed intensity, her arms burning with the effort as sweat dripped from her forehead onto David's still form. She had learned during her training that the human heart could sometimes be coaxed back to life with the right combination of pressure and timing. But she also knew that every second that passed without circulation was causing irreversible damage to David's brain and other organs. It was during her 4th round of compressions that she felt it, a faint flutter beneath her palms, as David's heart attempted to resume its normal rhythm. Rachel increased the intensity of her efforts, and suddenly, David's eyes flew open as he gasped for air, like a drowning man breaking the surface of a lake. His pulse was weak and irregular, but it was there, and for the moment, that was enough. The children erupted in cheers as David struggled to sit up, his color slowly returning as oxygen began flowing to his tissues once again. Rachel helped him into a more comfortable position while simultaneously calling 911 on her cell phone, her voice steady and professional as she reported the incident and requested immediate medical assistance. Within minutes, the intersection was flooded with emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights painting the morning sky in brilliant colors as paramedics, police officers, and firefighters swarmed the scene. As the paramedics loaded David onto a stretcher and prepared to transport him to the hospital, Rachel found herself surrounded by grateful parents who had arrived after hearing news of the incident on local radio stations. Michael Thompson, the principal of Riverside Elementary School, gripped her hand with tears in his eyes as he thanked her for saving not just David's life, but the lives of 30 children whose families would have been shattered if the bus had gone over the guardrail. But even as Rachel accepted the gratitude of the parents and school officials, she knew that her actions would have consequences. She had abandoned her post at the hospital without permission, left her shift early without proper authorization, and performed medical procedures outside of a licensed medical facility. The nursing board took such violations seriously, and Rachel had no illusions about what would happen when they learned of her actions. The phone call came 3 days later, just as Rachel was preparing to return to work after a brief suspension. Pending investigation, Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the chief administrator at Mercy General Hospital, delivered the news with the cold efficiency of someone who had made such calls many times before. Rachel's employment was terminated effective immediately. Her nursing license was under review, and she was prohibited from working in any medical capacity until the board completed its investigation. Rachel sat in her small apartment that evening, staring out at the city lights of Springfield Valley as she contemplated her future. She had saved a man's life and prevented a tragedy that would have devastated 30 families. But according to the medical establishment, she had violated protocol and acted beyond the scope of her authority. The irony was not lost on her that she was being punished for demonstrating exactly the kind of quick thinking and decisive action that had made her an exceptional nurse in the first place. The local media had picked up the story, and Channel 7 News had run a feature about the heroic nurse who had saved a busload of children. But the positive publicity did nothing to change the hospital's decision. In the eyes of the medical bureaucracy, rules were rules, and Rachel had broken them regardless of the outcome. She began updating her resume that night, wondering if any hospital in Springfield Valley would be willing to hire a nurse who had been terminated for insubordination, even if that insubordination had resulted in saving lives. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier who seemed far too formal for Rachel's modest neighborhood. The envelope bore the official seal of Springfield Valley City Hall, and Rachel's first thought was that she was being summoned to face some sort of legal action related to her unauthorized medical intervention. She had heard stories of Good Samaritans being sued by the very people they had tried to help, and she wondered if David Park's family had decided to pursue some sort of civil case against her. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. But instead of legal threats or court summons, she found herself reading an invitation that left her speechless. Mayor Patricia Williams was requesting her presence at City Hall for what the letter described as a private meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest and civic importance. The appointment was scheduled for the following Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the letter strongly suggested that Rachel should not discuss the meeting with anyone until after it had taken place. Rachel read the letter 3 times before the words fully registered in her mind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Why would the mayor want to meet with her? She was just an unemployed nurse who had acted on instinct to prevent a tragedy. She had no political connections, no influence in city affairs, and certainly no reason to be on the mayor's radar unless she was about to be prosecuted for some violation she wasn't aware of. The weekend passed slowly as Rachel tried to imagine what Mayor Williams might want to discuss. She researched the mayor online and learned that Patricia Williams was a former emergency room physician who had entered politics after witnessing too many preventable tragedies that could have been avoided with better city planning and emergency response procedures. Perhaps the mayor wanted to hear Rachel's perspective on the incident, or maybe she was gathering information for some sort of policy review. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzly, with the kind of persistent rain that made Springfield Valley look like a scene from a depressing movie. Rachel dressed in her best professional outfit, a navy blue suit that she had worn to job interviews in the past, and took the bus downtown to City Hall. The building was an imposing structure of granite and marble that had been built during the city's prosperous industrial era, its columns and arches designed to project authority and permanence. Rachel had never been inside City Hall before, and she was surprised by the elegant lobby with its polished floors and oil paintings of former mayors dating back to the 19th century. A receptionist directed her to the elevator that would take her to the mayor's office on the 5th floor, and as the doors closed behind her, Rachel wondered if she was making a terrible mistake by coming here alone without legal representation. The mayor's office was smaller than Rachel had expected, but it radiated warmth and accessibility rather than the cold formality she had anticipated. Mayor Williams rose from behind her desk as Rachel entered, extending her hand with a genuine smile that immediately put Rachel at ease. The mayor was younger than she appeared in newspaper photos, probably in her early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested someone who was accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. Mayor Williams gestured for Rachel to take a seat in one of the comfortable leather chairs that faced her desk, and then surprised Rachel by pouring 2 cups of coffee from a pot that sat on a side table. The mayor's manner was so informal and welcoming that Rachel began to relax, despite her nervousness about the mysterious nature of their meeting. The mayor began by asking Rachel to describe the events of that morning in her own words, listening intently as Rachel recounted her decision to abandon her car and run toward the out-of-control bus. Mayor Williams asked detailed questions about Rachel's thought process during those crucial moments, her assessment of David Park's condition, and her evaluation of the risks involved in her intervention. It quickly became clear that the mayor was not conducting an interrogation, but rather seeking to understand the mindset and motivations of someone who had acted with extraordinary courage under pressure. As their conversation continued, Mayor Williams revealed that she had spent considerable time reviewing the incident and its aftermath. She had spoken with David Park, who had made a full recovery and returned to work the previous week. She had interviewed several of the children who had been on the bus, along with their parents and teachers. She had even reviewed security camera footage from nearby buildings that had captured Rachel's actions from multiple angles. What emerged from the mayor's investigation was a picture of someone who had demonstrated not just medical skill and personal bravery, but also the kind of leadership and quick thinking that were desperately needed in city government. Mayor Williams explained that Springfield Valley was facing a crisis in emergency medical services, with response times increasing and public confidence declining due to budget cuts and personnel shortages. The city needed someone who could redesign the emergency response system from the ground up, someone who understood both the medical and logistical challenges involved in saving lives under pressure. Rachel listened in growing amazement as Mayor Williams outlined her proposal. The city was creating a new position, Director of Emergency Medical Services, with authority over all ambulance services, emergency medical training and coordination. With local hospitals, the salary would be substantial, far more than Rachel had earned as a staff nurse, and the position would come with a budget and staff sufficient to make real improvements in the city's emergency response capabilities. But the mayor wasn't finished. She explained that the city council had voted unanimously to establish a special recognition fund for citizens who demonstrated extraordinary heroism in service to their community. Rachel would be the first recipient of this award, which carried with it a cash prize of $200,000 and a commitment from the city to cover any legal or professional expenses related to her heroic actions. Rachel sat in stunned silence as the full implications of the mayor's offer sank in. Not only was she being offered a chance to rebuild her career, but she was being given an opportunity to make a difference on a scale she had never imagined possible. Instead of treating individual patients one at a time, she would be able to save lives by improving the entire emergency medical system for the city's 500,000 residents. The mayor seemed to understand Rachel's shock and gave her time to process the information before continuing. She explained that the position would require Rachel to work closely with hospital administrators, fire department officials, and other city departments to develop new protocols and procedures for emergency response. There would be political challenges and bureaucratic obstacles, but the mayor was confident that someone with Rachel's combination of medical expertise and practical experience would be able to navigate those difficulties successfully. Rachel found her voice at last and asked the obvious question, why her? Mayor Williams smiled and explained that the city had been searching for the right person to fill this role for months, interviewing candidates with impressive credentials and extensive experience in emergency management. But none of them had demonstrated the kind of real-world courage and decision-making ability that Rachel had shown on Pine Street. The mayor wanted someone who would act decisively when lives were at stake, someone who would put human welfare above bureaucratic procedures when the situation demanded it. As the meeting drew to a close, Mayor Williams asked Rachel to take some time to consider the offer before making a decision. The position would be available whenever Rachel was ready to accept it, and the mayor was willing to work with her to address any concerns or questions she might have. Rachel left City Hall that afternoon, feeling as though she had stepped into someone else's life, a life where good deeds were rewarded rather than punished, where courage was valued more than compliance with regulations. That evening, Rachel called her mother for the first time since losing her job at the hospital. She had been too embarrassed to explain her termination, too afraid that her family would see her actions as reckless rather than heroic. But as she described her meeting with the mayor and the incredible opportunity she had been offered, Rachel felt a sense of validation that she had been craving since the moment she decided to run toward that bus instead of away from it. Her mother listened to the entire story without interruption, and when Rachel finished, there was a long pause before her mother spoke. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "I've always been proud of you, but now I'm proud of the person you've become. You did the right thing, even when it cost you everything, and now you're being rewarded for having the courage to follow your heart." Rachel accepted the mayor's offer the following week, and within a month she was settling into her new office in the emergency services building downtown. The transition from bedside nursing to administrative leadership was challenging, but Rachel found that her years of experience in high-pressure medical situations had prepared her well for the demands of managing a complex organization with multiple stakeholders and competing priorities. Her first week as Director of Emergency Medical Services was a whirlwind of meetings, briefings, and policy reviews that left Rachel's head spinning. The emergency services building buzzed with activity from dawn until well past sunset. Housing not only the administrative offices, but also the central dispatch center that coordinated all emergency responses throughout Springfield Valley. Rachel's corner office overlooked the vehicle bay where ambulances and emergency response trucks sat ready for deployment, their red and white paint gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The scale of responsibility that now rested on Rachel's shoulders was staggering. Springfield Valley's emergency medical system responded to over 40,000 calls per year, ranging from minor injuries to mass casualty events. The department employed more than 200 paramedics, emergency medical technicians, and support staff, operating from 12 stations strategically located throughout the city. Rachel found herself managing budgets in the millions of dollars, overseeing equipment purchases that could mean the difference between life and death, and making policy decisions that would affect every resident of the city. During her second week on the job, Rachel implemented her first major change to the emergency response protocols. She had noticed during her review of response data that certain neighborhoods in Springfield Valley consistently experienced longer wait times for emergency medical services, particularly the low-income areas on the south side of the city where many immigrant families lived in crowded apartment complexes. The disparity wasn't intentional discrimination, but rather a result of poor station placement and outdated deployment strategies that hadn't been updated in over a decade. Rachel proposed relocating 2 ambulances from less busy stations to strategically positioned sites that would reduce response times in underserved areas by an average of 4 minutes. 4 minutes might not sound significant to someone who had never worked in emergency medicine, but Rachel knew from her years in the emergency room that those 4 minutes could mean the difference between a patient who recovered fully and one who suffered permanent brain damage from lack of oxygen. The proposal met with resistance from some veteran supervisors who argued that changing established procedures would create confusion and potentially compromise response times in other areas. Rachel listened to their concerns with patience and respect, but she also presented them with detailed statistical analysis showing how the redistribution would improve overall response times across the entire city. She had learned during her nursing career that data-driven arguments were more persuasive than emotional appeals, even when the emotional stakes were literally matters of life and death. The resistance wasn't limited to internal politics. Rachel discovered that the Emergency Medical Services Department had developed an adversarial relationship with several of the city's hospitals over the years, with each side blaming the other for delays and communication failures that sometimes resulted in poor patient outcomes. Hospital emergency departments complained that paramedics weren't providing adequate information about incoming patients, while paramedics argued that hospitals were taking too long to accept transfers and provide feedback about patient care. Rachel decided to address this problem by organizing monthly meetings between hospital emergency department directors and emergency medical services supervisors. The first meeting was tense, with representatives from both sides airing grievances that had been festering for years. Rachel facilitated the discussion with the diplomatic skills she had developed during her nursing career, when she had often served as a bridge between doctors, patients, and families during difficult situations. Gradually, the monthly meetings began to produce results. Hospital staff began to understand the challenges faced by paramedics working in less than ideal conditions with limited equipment, while emergency medical services personnel gained insight into the complex triage decisions that emergency room doctors had to make when multiple critical patients arrived simultaneously. Rachel instituted a new protocol requiring paramedics to provide more detailed patient information during transport, while hospitals agreed to provide faster turnaround times for ambulance crews dropping off patients. The changes weren't dramatic or headline-grabbing, but they were making a real difference in patient outcomes. Response times improved across the city, patient satisfaction scores increased, and most importantly, the number of preventable deaths declined measurably during Rachel's first 6 months in the position. The statistical improvements were gratifying, but for Rachel, the real validation came from the individual stories of lives saved because emergency medical services had arrived just a few minutes sooner, or because hospital staff had been better prepared to receive critical patients. One such case occurred during a brutally hot summer afternoon when Rachel received an emergency call about a construction worker who had collapsed from heat stroke at a downtown building site. Under the old system, the nearest ambulance would have been dispatched from a station nearly 8 miles away, resulting in a response time of at least 12 minutes through heavy traffic. But because of Rachel's redistribution plan, an ambulance station just 4 blocks away was able to reach the scene in less than 3 minutes. The paramedics found the construction worker, a 34-year-old father of 2 named Carlos Martinez, unconscious and suffering from dangerously elevated body temperature. His co-workers had moved him into the shade and were pouring water over his body, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The paramedics immediately began aggressive cooling measures and intravenous fluid replacement while transporting Carlos to the nearest hospital, where emergency room staff were already prepared to receive him thanks to the improved communication protocols Rachel had implemented. Carlos spent 2 days in intensive care, but made a full recovery and returned to work the following week. His wife, Maria, sought out Rachel's office to thank her personally for the changes that had saved her husband's life. As Maria spoke through tears about how close they had come to losing everything, Rachel was reminded once again why she had been drawn to healthcare in the first place. It wasn't about the prestige or the salary or the recognition. It was about the profound satisfaction that came from knowing your work had made a real difference in someone's life. But even as Rachel celebrated the successes of her new position, she remained haunted by the circumstances that had brought her there. David Park had returned to driving school buses and had suffered no lasting effects from his heart attack, thanks in large part to the immediate medical intervention he had received. The 30 children who had been on the bus that morning had all received counseling to help them process the traumatic experience, and most had returned to their normal routines within a few weeks. Rachel often thought about those children and wondered how the experience would shape their understanding of the world as they grew older. Would they remember her as the woman who had saved their lives? Or would the incident fade into the general blur of childhood memories? She hoped they would grow up with a sense that adults could be counted on to protect them when danger threatened, rather than learning too early that the world was an unpredictable and frightening place. The media attention surrounding Rachel's heroic actions had gradually faded as other stories captured the public's interest, but she continued to receive letters and emails from people who had been inspired by her example. Parents wrote to thank her for showing their children what courage looked like in practice. Nurses and other healthcare workers shared their own stories of times when they had faced difficult decisions between following protocols and doing what they believed was right. One letter that particularly moved Rachel came from a young nursing student named Jennifer Walsh, who had been struggling with doubts about her career choice after witnessing what she perceived as callousness and bureaucratic indifference in the hospital where she was completing her clinical rotations. Jennifer wrote that Rachel's story had reminded her why she had wanted to become a nurse in the first place and had given her the courage to continue pursuing her degree despite the obstacles and disappointments she had encountered. Rachel took the time to write a personal response to Jennifer, sharing some of the lessons she had learned during her own nursing education and early career. She explained that healthcare was an imperfect system populated by imperfect people, but that didn't diminish the importance of the work or the difference that one dedicated person could make. She encouraged Jennifer to maintain her idealism, while developing the practical skills and political awareness necessary to navigate the complex realities of modern healthcare. The exchange of letters with Jennifer led Rachel to realize that her platform as Director of Emergency Medical Services gave her an opportunity to influence the next generation of healthcare workers in ways that went beyond policy changes and administrative improvements. She began accepting invitations to speak at nursing schools and medical conferences, sharing her experiences and encouraging students to maintain their commitment to patient care, even when institutional pressures seemed to push them in other directions. Rachel's first major speaking engagement was at the Springfield Valley School of Nursing, where she addressed an auditorium filled with first-year students who were just beginning their clinical rotations. She spoke about the importance of developing both technical competence and moral courage, explaining that the most critical decisions in healthcare often had to be made in situations where there was no time to consult protocols or seek approval from supervisors. The students listened with rapt attention as Rachel described the moment when she had to choose between following hospital procedures and running toward a bus filled with children in mortal danger. She emphasized that she wasn't advocating for reckless disregard of rules and regulations, but rather for the development of judgment and intuition that would allow them to recognize when circumstances demanded extraordinary action. During the question and answer period following her presentation, a student asked Rachel if she had any regrets about her decision to intervene in the bus incident, given that it had cost her previous job and created significant personal upheaval. Rachel considered the question carefully before responding, acknowledging that the path from that moment to her current position had been difficult and uncertain, with no guarantee of a positive outcome. But she also told the students that regret was incompatible with a career in healthcare, where split-second decisions could have irreversible consequences. She explained that healthcare workers had to learn to live with the choices they made, under pressure, whether those choices led to successful outcomes or tragic failures. The key was to make decisions based on the best information available at the time, guided by training, experience, and a fundamental commitment to preserving human life. As Rachel's reputation as a speaker grew, she began receiving invitations from organizations outside the healthcare field. Business groups wanted to hear about decision-making under pressure, while leadership development programs were interested in her insights about managing organizational change. Rachel was initially reluctant to stray too far from her medical background, but she gradually came to understand that the principles that guided good healthcare could be applied to other fields where people's welfare was at stake. One particularly memorable speaking engagement took place at a conference for emergency management professionals, where Rachel shared the podium with police chiefs, fire department commanders, and disaster response coordinators from across the region. Her presentation focused on the importance of cross-agency communication and coordination during emergency situations, drawing on her experience of improving relationships between emergency medical services and hospital emergency departments. The audience was particularly interested in Rachel's description of how she had overcome institutional resistance to change within her own organization. She explained that successful reform required not just good ideas, but also the political skills necessary to build coalitions of support among stakeholders who might initially be skeptical or resistant. She emphasized the importance of listening to concerns and addressing them with data and evidence rather than dismissing them as obstructionism. During the networking session that followed her presentation, Rachel was approached by Captain Robert Chen of the Springfield Valley Fire Department, who had attended her talk with great interest. Captain Chen explained that his department was facing similar challenges in coordinating with other emergency response agencies, particularly during large-scale incidents that required multiple types of expertise and equipment. The conversation with Captain Chen led to a collaboration that would become one of Rachel's most significant achievements as Director of Emergency Medical Services. Together, they developed a comprehensive emergency response training program that brought together personnel from police, fire, emergency medical services, and hospital emergency departments for realistic simulation exercises that tested their ability to work together under pressure. The first joint training exercise took place at an abandoned shopping mall on the outskirts of Springfield Valley, where participants were presented with a simulated mass casualty event involving multiple injured victims requiring different levels of medical care. Police officers had to secure the scene while firefighters extracted victims from simulated wreckage, paramedics provided emergency medical treatment, and hospital staff prepared to receive patients with varying degrees of injury. The exercise revealed numerous communication and coordination problems that had never been apparent during single-agency training sessions. Radio frequencies weren't compatible between different departments. Medical personnel weren't familiar with police and fire department command structures, and hospital staff had unrealistic expectations about the information that would be available about incoming patients during chaotic emergency situations. Rather than viewing these problems as failures, Rachel and Captain Chen treated them as valuable learning opportunities that would help all the agencies involved provide better service to the community. They organized debriefing sessions where participants could discuss what had worked well and what needed improvement, creating an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared problem-solving rather than blame and defensiveness. The joint training program gradually expanded to include more agencies and more complex scenarios, eventually attracting attention from emergency management professionals in other cities who wanted to learn from Springfield Valley's innovative approach. Rachel found herself traveling to conferences and workshops around the country, sharing her experiences and learning from the successes and failures of other communities facing similar challenges. But even as her professional profile continued to rise, Rachel never forgot the personal relationships that had brought her to this point. She maintained regular contact with David Park, who had become something of a local celebrity himself after his story was featured in several national publications about workplace health and safety. David had used his experience to become an advocate for better health screening and emergency response training for public transportation workers, speaking at conferences and working with unions to improve safety protocols. The 30 children who had been on the bus during the incident had grown and changed in ways that reflected their resilience and the support they had received from their families and schools. Several of them had expressed interest in careers in healthcare or emergency services, inspired by their early exposure to the life and death importance of these professions. Rachel had established a scholarship fund to help students from Riverside Elementary School pursue education in healthcare fields, funded in part by speaking fees and donations from people who had been moved by her story. One of those children, a girl named Sophie Williams, who had been 8 years old at the time of the incident, wrote Rachel a letter on the 5th anniversary of the bus incident. Sophie, now 13 and in 8th grade, described how the experience had shaped her understanding of courage and responsibility. She wrote that she had initially been terrified and confused by what had happened, but that over time she had come to appreciate the bravery that Rachel had shown in risking her own safety to help others. Sophie's letter included a school essay. She had written about heroes and role models, in which she described Rachel not as someone with superhuman abilities, but as an ordinary person who had made an extraordinary choice when faced with a critical moment. The essay explained that true heroism wasn't about seeking recognition or reward, but about doing the right thing even when it was difficult or dangerous. Reading Sophie's essay, Rachel was struck by the maturity and insight of someone so young, and she realized that her actions on that October morning had created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate crisis she had helped resolve. The children who had been on the bus were growing up with a different understanding of what adults could accomplish when they acted with courage and compassion, and some of them were choosing career paths that would allow them to help others in similar ways. As Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her from a hospital parking lot to the director's office of one of the most respected emergency medical services departments in the region, she understood that success couldn't be measured solely in terms of personal achievement or professional recognition. The true measure of her impact would be found in the lives saved by improved emergency response systems, the careers inspired by her example, and the communities made safer by the collaborative relationships she had helped build between different agencies and organizations. The transformation from bedside nurse to healthcare administrator had required Rachel to develop new skills and take on responsibilities she had never imagined. But the core values that had driven her to run toward that bus remained the foundation of everything she did. Whether she was reviewing budget proposals, negotiating with union representatives, or speaking to auditoriums full of students, Rachel never lost sight of the fundamental truth that had guided her throughout her career. Every decision in healthcare ultimately came down to the question of how to best serve the people who depended on the system for their safety and well-being. The unexpected path that had led Rachel from professional disaster to professional triumph had taught her that setbacks and obstacles were often disguised opportunities for growth and positive change. The hospital administration that had fired her for breaking protocol had inadvertently created the circumstances that allowed her to make a much larger impact on emergency medical care throughout the entire city. The career crisis that had seemed like a devastating failure had actually been the catalyst for achievements she never could have imagined while working as a staff nurse. The phone call came on a quiet Tuesday evening in early September, just as Rachel was finishing her dinner and reviewing reports from the latest emergency response statistics. She had been Director of Emergency Medical Services for 18 months now, and the department was performing better than it had in years. Response times were down, patient satisfaction scores were up, and the collaborative relationships she had built with hospitals and other emergency agencies were serving as a model for other cities across the region. Rachel almost didn't answer the phone when she saw the unfamiliar number on her caller ID, assuming it was another telemarketer or automated survey. But something prompted her to pick up, and she was surprised to hear the voice of Mayor Patricia Williams on the other end of the line. The mayor's tone was different from their usual professional conversations, carrying an undercurrent of excitement that immediately caught Rachel's attention. Mayor Williams asked if Rachel could come to City Hall the following morning for what she described as an important meeting involving some special visitors who had specifically requested to meet with her. The mayor was deliberately vague about the details, explaining only that the visitors were from Washington, D.C., and that their interest in Rachel stemmed from her innovative work in emergency medical services and her reputation as someone who could implement meaningful change within complex bureaucratic systems. Rachel spent a restless night wondering what federal officials could possibly want with her. Her work in Springfield Valley had gained some national attention through conference presentations and published articles in emergency management journals, but she couldn't imagine why anyone in the nation's capital would consider her experience relevant to federal policy or programs. She dressed carefully the next morning, choosing a conservative business suit that would be appropriate for whatever formal meeting awaited her. City Hall buzzed with unusual activity as Rachel made her way to the mayor's office. Security personnel were more visible than usual, and she noticed several black sedans with government license plates parked in the reserved spaces near the building's main entrance. The mayor's secretary, normally cheerful and talkative, seemed unusually formal as she escorted Rachel directly into the mayor's private conference room without the usual small talk. Mayor Williams rose to greet Rachel as she entered the conference room, but Rachel's attention was immediately drawn to the three people seated around the polished mahogany table. The woman at the head of the table was impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit with the kind of understated elegance that suggested both authority and substantial budget for professional wardrobe. Her silver hair was styled in a sophisticated cut, and her direct gaze conveyed the confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected millions of people. The woman extended her hand as Mayor Williams made the introductions. Dr. Margaret Stevens was the administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, one of the most powerful positions in the federal government's disaster response hierarchy. Seated beside her were Dr. James Morrison, Deputy Director of the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Emergency Preparedness, and Colonel Sarah Martinez, a military liaison specializing in domestic emergency response coordination. Rachel felt her pulse quicken as she realized the significance of having three such high-ranking federal officials in Springfield Valley's modest City Hall conference room. Dr. Stevens explained that they had been monitoring Rachel's work for several months, not through any formal investigation, but as part of an ongoing effort to identify innovative approaches to emergency medical services that could be scaled up and implemented at the national level. The federal government was facing a crisis in emergency medical response capabilities, Dr. Stevens continued. Rural areas were struggling with inadequate coverage and lengthy response times, while urban centers were overwhelmed by increasing call volumes and aging infrastructure. Traditional approaches to solving these problems had proven ineffective, largely because they focused on throwing money at symptoms rather than addressing the underlying systemic issues that prevented different agencies from working together. Effectively, Dr. Morrison leaned forward as he described the specific challenges that had brought them to Springfield Valley. The Department of Health and Human Services had been tasked with developing new standards for emergency medical response coordination, but previous efforts had failed because they were designed by bureaucrats and consultants who had never actually worked in emergency services. They needed someone with real-world experience who had demonstrated the ability to implement change within resistant institutional structures. Colonel Martinez added that the military had observed Rachel's joint training exercises between different emergency response agencies with particular interest. The Department of Defense was exploring ways to better integrate military medical resources with civilian emergency services during natural disasters and other large-scale emergencies, but they had struggled to find civilian leaders who understood both the operational requirements and the political sensitivities involved in such collaborations. Rachel listened in growing amazement as the three officials outlined their proposal. The federal government wanted to create a new position, Director of National Emergency Medical Coordination, with authority to develop and implement standardized protocols for emergency medical response across all 50 states. The position would involve working with state and local governments, coordinating with federal agencies, and overseeing the distribution of billions of dollars in emergency preparedness funding. The salary and benefits package they described was substantial, far exceeding what Rachel earned in Springfield Valley, but more importantly, the position would give her the opportunity to influence emergency medical care for the entire country. Instead of improving response times for 500,000 residents, she would be working to save lives across a nation of over 300 million people. Dr. Stevens explained that Rachel had been selected not despite her lack of federal government experience, but because of it. Too many federal initiatives failed because they were designed by people who understood bureaucratic processes but had never faced the life-and-death pressure of actual emergency response. They needed someone who would prioritize effectiveness over political considerations, someone who had demonstrated the courage to make difficult decisions when lives were at stake. The offer came with significant challenges, Dr. Morrison warned. Rachel would be working in an environment where every decision was scrutinized by Congress, the media, and advocacy groups representing various competing interests. She would need to build coalitions among stakeholders who had been fighting each other for decades, and she would have to navigate the complex politics of federal-state relations while maintaining focus on the ultimate goal of saving lives. Colonel Martinez added that the position would require extensive travel and long hours, with the expectation that Rachel would be available around the clock during major emergencies. The personal sacrifices would be substantial, and the stress levels would far exceed anything she had experienced in Springfield Valley. But they believed that someone with her combination of medical expertise, administrative experience, and proven leadership ability was uniquely qualified to succeed in such a demanding role. Rachel asked for time to consider the offer, and the federal officials readily agreed, explaining that they understood the magnitude of what they were asking. Dr. Stevens gave Rachel her direct phone number and invited her to call with any questions or concerns that might arise during her deliberation process. They would need an answer within 2 weeks, as the position needed to be filled before the start of the new fiscal year. As the meeting concluded, Mayor Williams walked Rachel back to her office, both women processing the implications of what had just occurred. The mayor expressed mixed emotions about the possibility of losing Rachel to the federal government, acknowledging that Springfield Valley had benefited enormously from her leadership, while recognizing that her talents could make an even greater impact at the national level. Rachel spent the remainder of the day in a fog of disbelief and uncertainty. The opportunity was beyond anything she had ever imagined possible, but it would require her to leave behind the community and relationships she had worked so hard to build in Springfield Valley. She thought about the paramedics and emergency medical technicians who had initially been skeptical of her reforms, but had become her strongest supporters, and about the hospital administrators who had learned to trust her judgment even when her proposals seemed unconventional. That evening, Rachel drove to the intersection where she had first encountered the runaway school bus nearly 2 years earlier. The area had been transformed by a major road improvement project that included better traffic signals and improved pedestrian safety features, but she could still picture exactly where the bus had been heading when she made the split-second decision that changed the trajectory of her entire life. Standing at that intersection, Rachel reflected on the unpredictable nature of opportunity and responsibility. She had been walking to her car after a routine hospital shift when circumstances thrust her into a situation that demanded immediate action. Now she was being asked to make another life-changing decision, but this time she had the luxury of careful consideration rather than split-second instinct. The next morning, Rachel called Dr. Stevens to ask about the specific challenges the federal position would entail. Dr. Stevens was remarkably candid about the obstacles Rachel would face, describing a federal bureaucracy that was often resistant to change and a political environment where good intentions could be derailed by partisan fighting and special interests. She explained that previous attempts to improve emergency medical coordination had failed because they had been implemented from the top down without sufficient input from people who actually worked in the field. Dr. Stevens believed that Rachel's background as a practicing nurse and frontline administrator would give her credibility with state and local officials who had grown cynical about federal initiatives. But she also warned that Rachel would need to develop thick skin and diplomatic skills to survive in Washington, where personal attacks and public criticism were routine parts of the job. Rachel spent the following week consulting with colleagues and mentors about the decision she faced. Captain Robert Chen from the fire department urged her to accept the federal position, arguing that her reforms in Springfield Valley had already proven their effectiveness and could benefit emergency responders across the country. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, her former supervisor at Mercy General Hospital, offered a different perspective, warning that federal positions often came with political constraints that could frustrate someone accustomed to implementing practical solutions. The most meaningful conversation took place with David Park, the bus driver whose life Rachel had saved during that pivotal moment that had set everything in motion. David had become not just a friend, but also an informal advisor whose perspective on life and death situations Rachel valued enormously. They met for coffee at a small cafe near Riverside Elementary School, where David still picked up children for his daily routes. David listened thoughtfully as Rachel described the federal offer and her uncertainty about whether to accept it. He reminded her that their first encounter had been the result of Rachel's willingness to act without knowing what the consequences would be. And he suggested that perhaps this new opportunity required the same kind of faith in her ability to make a positive difference even in unfamiliar circumstances. The bus driver's words resonated with Rachel because they reminded her that her entire career had been built on taking calculated risks in service of helping others. When she had decided to become a nurse, she had chosen a profession that demanded constant learning and adaptation. When she had intervened to save David's life, she had acted on instinct and training without knowing how the situation would resolve. When she had accepted the position as Director of Emergency Medical Services, she had entered a field where she had no previous administrative experience. Each transition had required Rachel to move beyond her comfort zone and develop new capabilities. But each had also provided opportunities to make a larger impact than would have been possible if she had remained in familiar territory. The federal position represented another such leap, one that would challenge her in ways she couldn't fully anticipate, but that would also allow her to influence emergency medical care on a scale that matched her ambitions for systemic improvement. Rachel's decision crystallized during an emergency response call that occurred during her final week of deliberation. A multi-vehicle accident on the interstate had resulted in several serious injuries and required coordination between multiple emergency agencies. As she observed the smooth collaboration between paramedics, firefighters, police officers, and hospital staff, Rachel realized that the improvements she had helped implement in Springfield Valley represented just a small fraction of what could be accomplished with adequate resources and national coordination. The accident scene reminded her that emergency medical care was ultimately about individual human beings facing the worst moments of their lives, whether they were injured motorists on an interstate highway or children trapped in a runaway school. Thus, the statistical improvements and administrative efficiencies she had achieved in Springfield Valley were meaningful because they translated into real people receiving faster, better medical care when they needed it most. Rachel called Dr. Stevens the following morning to accept the federal position. The administrator expressed genuine pleasure at Rachel's decision and immediately began outlining the transition process that would move Rachel from Springfield Valley to Washington, D.C. within 6 weeks. There would be extensive briefings on federal procedures and regulations, meetings with congressional staff members who oversee emergency preparedness funding, and introductions to the various stakeholders Rachel would need to work with in her new role. The announcement of Rachel's appointment generated significant media attention, both locally and nationally. Springfield Valley's newspapers ran lengthy profiles describing her journey from hospital nurse to federal administrator, while national publications focused on the unusual career path that had brought someone with her background to such a prominent position in the federal government. The local coverage emphasized Rachel's connection to the community and her commitment to improving emergency medical care for ordinary citizens. Several articles included interviews with paramedics and hospital staff members who described specific ways that Rachel's leadership had improved their ability to serve patients effectively. The stories painted a picture of someone who had never lost sight of the human impact of administrative decisions, even as she had gained influence and authority. National media coverage took a different approach, focusing on Rachel's appointment as evidence of the federal government's commitment to bringing practical experience to policy-making positions that had traditionally been filled by career bureaucrats or political appointees. Some commentators praised the decision to select someone with frontline experience, while others questioned whether Rachel had sufficient background in federal procedures and congressional relations to succeed in such a high-profile position. Rachel paid little attention to the media coverage, focusing instead on the complex transition process that would move her from Springfield Valley to the nation's capital. She worked closely with her deputy director to ensure continuity of leadership in the Emergency Medical Services Department, and she spent countless hours documenting the procedures and relationships that had made their reforms successful. The most difficult part of the transition was saying goodbye to the colleagues and community members who had supported her throughout her tenure as director. The Emergency Medical Services Department organized a farewell reception that was attended by hundreds of people, including many of the children who had been on David Park's bus during the incident that had started Rachel's journey toward federal service. Sophie Williams, now 14 years old and preparing to enter high school, presented Rachel with a scrapbook that contained letters and drawings from all 30 children who had been on the bus that October morning. Each child had written about how the experience had influenced their understanding of courage and service, and many had included drawings depicting Rachel as a superhero figure who had saved their lives through quick thinking and brave action. As Rachel flipped through the pages of the scrapbook, she was struck by the children's ability to articulate the lessons they had learned from witnessing adult courage under pressure. Several of the older children had written about their career aspirations, with many expressing interest in healthcare, emergency services, or other helping professions. Rachel realized that her actions on that October morning had not only saved 30 lives, but had also inspired a new generation of young people to consider careers devoted to helping others. The farewell reception concluded with remarks from Mayor Patricia Williams, who described Rachel's tenure as Director of Emergency Medical Services as a model of effective public service. The mayor emphasized that Rachel's greatest achievement had been her ability to maintain focus on the human impact of policy decisions while navigating the complex political and administrative challenges inherent in government work. As Rachel prepared to leave Springfield Valley for Washington, D.C., she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from a hospital parking lot to the highest levels of federal government. The path had been marked by risk-taking, hard work, and occasional setbacks, but it had consistently been guided by a simple principle: the belief that systems and institutions should serve the people who depend on them rather than the other way around. The federal position would test that principle in ways Rachel couldn't fully anticipate, but she was confident that the lessons she had learned in Springfield Valley would serve her well in whatever challenges lay ahead. She had discovered that meaningful change was possible even within large, complex organizations, provided that leaders maintained clear priorities and the courage to pursue them despite institutional resistance. Rachel's appointment to the federal position represented more than a personal career advancement. It symbolized the possibility that frontline experience and practical wisdom could influence policymaking at the highest levels of government. Her success or failure in Washington would determine whether other communities might benefit from the kinds of reforms she had implemented in Springfield Valley, and whether the federal government could become more responsive to the real world needs of emergency responders and the citizens they served. The Federal Emergency Management Agency headquarters in Washington, D.C., stretched across several city blocks, its imposing concrete facade reflecting the seriousness of its mission to coordinate disaster response for an entire nation. Rachel's new office occupied a corner of the 7th floor, with windows overlooking the bustling streets where tourists and government workers mingled in the shadow of monuments to American democracy. The transition from Springfield Valley's modest emergency services building to this seat of federal power felt surreal, even after 6 weeks of intensive briefings and orientation sessions. Rachel's first month in Washington had been a whirlwind of meetings with congressional staff members, policy briefings with other federal agencies, and introductory sessions with the vast network of state and local officials who would be crucial to implementing any meaningful reforms. The complexity of federal emergency management made her previous challenges in Springfield Valley seem quaint by comparison. Where she had once coordinated between 3 or 4 agencies serving 500,000 people, she now faced the task of harmonizing emergency medical responses across 50 states, hundreds of federal facilities, and countless local jurisdictions. With wildly different resources and capabilities, the scale of the problems Rachel encountered during her first weeks in the federal position was staggering. Rural counties in Montana and Wyoming had emergency medical response times exceeding 40 minutes, while urban centers like Detroit and Philadelphia struggled with overwhelmed systems that couldn't adequately serve their populations. Some states had invested heavily in modern communication systems and training programs, while others operated with equipment and protocols that hadn't been updated in decades. Perhaps most frustrating was the discovery that many of these problems persisted, not due to lack of funding, but because of poor coordination and communication between different levels of government. Federal grants intended to improve emergency medical services often sat unused because local officials didn't understand the application procedures, while state agencies hoarded resources rather than sharing them with neighboring jurisdictions that might need them more urgently. Rachel's initial strategy focused on listening rather than proposing immediate solutions. She spent her first 2 months traveling to emergency medical services departments across the country, meeting with frontline paramedics, emergency room doctors, and local administrators who dealt with the daily reality of saving lives within. Constrained budgets and bureaucratic limitations, these field visits reminded her of the human faces behind the statistics and policy papers that dominated her Washington meetings. In rural Kansas, Rachel met with a paramedic named Tom Bradley, who covered a territory larger than some eastern states with just 2 ambulances and a handful of volunteer emergency medical technicians. Tom described situations where critically injured patients had died during transport to hospitals over an hour away, deaths that might have been prevented with better coordination between rural and urban medical facilities. His frustration with federal programs that promised help but delivered paperwork instead was evident in every conversation. The contrast with her visit to Atlanta's sophisticated emergency medical command center couldn't have been more stark. The Georgia capital had invested millions in state-of-the-art dispatch systems, advanced life support equipment, and comprehensive training programs that produced some of the best emergency medical outcomes in the nation. But even this well-funded system struggled with coordination problems when responding to emergencies that crossed jurisdictional boundaries or required resources beyond what any single agency could provide. Rachel's conversations with emergency medical personnel across the country revealed a consistent pattern of problems that transcended regional differences or funding levels. Communication systems that couldn't talk to each other, training programs that weren't standardized between different agencies, and bureaucratic procedures that prioritized documentation over patient care. Most frustrating was the discovery that many effective solutions had already been developed by innovative local programs, but there was no mechanism for sharing these successes with other communities facing similar challenges. The political environment in Washington added layers of complexity that Rachel had never encountered in Springfield Valley. Every proposal she developed had to be vetted by multiple agencies, reviewed by congressional staff members representing different political parties and regional interests, and coordinated with state officials who jealously guarded their autonomy from federal interference. Simple improvements that could be implemented overnight in a local jurisdiction required months of negotiation and compromise at the federal level. Rachel's first major initiative focused on creating standardized communication protocols that would allow emergency medical services, fire departments, police agencies, and hospitals to coordinate more effectively during large-scale emergencies. The technical aspects of the proposal were straightforward, building on successful models she had observed in several progressive jurisdictions. But the political challenges proved formidable as different agencies fought to protect their existing systems and procedures. The Department of Homeland Security worried that standardized communication protocols might create security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by terrorists or foreign adversaries. The Department of Defense was concerned about potential conflicts with military communication systems used during domestic emergency responses. State officials feared that federal standards would override local preferences and reduce their flexibility to address regional needs. Rachel spent countless hours in meetings trying to address these concerns while maintaining focus on the ultimate goal of improving emergency medical response capabilities. She learned to speak the language of Washington politics, framing her proposals in terms of homeland security, economic development, and federal-state cooperation, rather than simply emphasizing the medical benefits that motivated her personally. The breakthrough came during a simulated emergency exercise conducted at a military base in Virginia, where Rachel had arranged for representatives from multiple federal agencies, state governments, and local emergency services to participate. In a realistic disaster scenario, the exercise revealed communication failures so severe that different agencies were literally working at cross purposes, duplicating some efforts while leaving critical needs unaddressed. Video footage from the exercise provided powerful evidence for Rachel's argument that standardized communication protocols were essential for effective emergency response. Even the most skeptical agency representatives couldn't deny the problems that were clearly documented in the simulation results. Within weeks of the exercise, Rachel had secured approval for a pilot program that would test her communication standards in 5 states, representing different geographic regions and emergency response challenges. The pilot program's success exceeded even Rachel's optimistic projections. Response times improved measurably in all 5 test states, with the most dramatic improvements occurring in rural areas where better coordination allowed urban resources to assist with complex medical emergencies. More importantly, the program demonstrated that standardization didn't require eliminating local flexibility, as different jurisdictions found ways to adapt the common protocols to their specific needs and circumstances. Word of the pilot program's success spread quickly through the emergency management community, and Rachel found herself fielding requests from governors and emergency management directors who wanted to participate in expanded testing. The positive results also attracted attention from congressional appropriations committees, who had grown weary of funding federal programs that produced impressive reports, but little measurable improvement in emergency response capabilities. Rachel leveraged this political support to secure funding for a much more ambitious initiative, a comprehensive overhaul of federal emergency medical training standards. Her analysis had revealed that emergency medical technicians and paramedics received vastly different levels of training depending on where they lived and worked, creating dangerous gaps in capability that could prove fatal during interstate emergencies or when personnel from different agencies had to work together. The training standardization project required Rachel to build coalitions among groups that had historically viewed each other with suspicion. Medical schools and nursing programs worried that federal standards might interfere with their academic autonomy. Labor unions representing emergency medical personnel feared that new requirements might eliminate jobs or reduce compensation. State licensing boards were concerned about federal interference with their regulatory authority. Rachel addressed these concerns by involving all stakeholders in the development process rather than imposing solutions from Washington. She organized working groups that included representatives from medical schools, labor unions, state licensing boards, and emergency medical services departments, tasking them with developing training standards that would improve patient outcomes while respecting the legitimate interests of different constituencies. The collaborative approach required more time and patience than Rachel would have preferred, but it produced training standards that had broad support across the emergency medical community. The new requirements emphasized practical skills and decision-making abilities rather than memorization of procedures, and they included provisions for ongoing education that would help emergency medical personnel keep pace with advancing medical knowledge and technology. Implementation of the new training standards revealed the extent to which Rachel's reputation had grown within the federal government and emergency management community. States that had initially resisted federal involvement in emergency medical Services now competed to be selected as demonstration sites for her programs. Congressional representatives who had once viewed emergency medical coordination as a low-priority issue began touting their support for Rachel's initiatives in speeches and press releases. The transformation in Rachel's professional status was accompanied by personal changes that sometimes left her feeling disconnected from the values and relationships that had originally motivated her career in healthcare. The daily routine of federal administration bore little resemblance to the hands-on medical care that had drawn her to nursing, and the political considerations that dominated Washington decision-making often seemed to overshadow the patient care priorities that she considered most important. Rachel's sense of purpose was renewed during a visit to New Orleans to assess emergency medical preparedness in areas still recovering from hurricane damage. She accompanied a paramedic crew on several emergency calls, experiencing firsthand the challenges faced by emergency medical personnel working in understaffed and under-equipped systems. The patients they treated that day were real people whose lives depended on the quality of emergency medical care, not statistics in federal reports or talking points in congressional hearings. One call involved an elderly man named Vincent Thibodeau, who had suffered a stroke in his shotgun house in the 9th Ward. The paramedics who responded had been trained under Rachel's new federal standards, and their assessment and treatment of Mr. Thibodeau demonstrated skills that might not have been available just 2 years earlier. More importantly, the communication protocols Rachel had developed allowed the paramedics to coordinate seamlessly with the hospital emergency department, ensuring that stroke specialists were ready to provide immediate treatment upon arrival. Mr. Thibodeau made a full recovery and returned home within a week, an outcome that might not have been possible under the old system of fragmented training and poor communication. As Rachel sat with his family during his hospital discharge, she was reminded that all the meetings and policy papers and political negotiations were ultimately about moments like this, when improved systems and better training translated into real people living healthy lives with their families. The success of Rachel's federal initiatives attracted international attention from emergency management professionals studying American approaches to disaster preparedness. She found herself representing the United States at conferences in Europe and Asia, sharing her experiences with officials from countries facing similar challenges in coordinating emergency medical responses across diverse regions and jurisdictions. These international exchanges provided Rachel with new perspectives on emergency medical coordination and introduced her to innovative approaches being developed in other countries. The Netherlands had pioneered helicopter-based emergency medical services that could reach remote areas quickly, while Germany had developed sophisticated communication systems that automatically coordinated between different types of emergency responders. Japan's experience with earthquake response had produced training programs that emphasized rapid deployment and resource sharing between different regions. Rachel incorporated the best ideas from these international models into her federal programs, adapting foreign innovations to American conditions and regulatory requirements. The result was a comprehensive approach to emergency medical coordination that drew on successful practices from around the world while respecting the unique characteristics of American federalism and emergency response traditions. As Rachel's third year in the federal position began, the cumulative impact of her initiatives was becoming apparent in emergency medical outcome statistics from across the country. Response times had improved in virtually every region. Patient survival rates were increasing, and emergency medical personnel reported higher levels of job satisfaction and professional confidence. More importantly, the collaborative relationship she had fostered between different agencies and levels of government were producing innovations and improvements that went beyond her original programs. The ultimate validation of Rachel's work came during a major earthquake that struck the Pacific Northwest, testing emergency response systems under the most challenging possible conditions. The disaster affected multiple states and required coordination between dozens of federal agencies, hundreds of state and local organizations, and thousands of emergency response personnel. Under previous emergency management approaches, such complex disasters had typically been characterized by communication failures, resource conflicts, and delayed responses that cost lives and prolonged suffering. But the earthquake response demonstrated the effectiveness of the standardized communication protocols, training programs, and coordination mechanisms that Rachel had spent 3 years developing and implementing. Emergency medical personnel from different states worked together seamlessly, sharing resources and expertise in ways that maximize their collective capability to save lives and treat injuries. Federal agencies coordinated with state and local officials efficiently, avoiding the turf battles and bureaucratic delays that had plagued previous disaster responses. The earthquake response attracted widespread media coverage that portrayed federal emergency management in unusually positive terms. Editorial writers and television commentators praised the coordinated response as evidence that government could work effectively when properly organized and led. Several news outlets specifically credited Rachel's leadership for the improved performance, describing her as an example of what could be accomplished when practical experience was applied to federal policy making. The positive coverage attracted attention from the highest levels of federal government, including the White House staff responsible for disaster preparedness policy. Rachel found herself briefing senior presidential advisors on emergency medical coordination and participating in policy discussions that would shape federal disaster response for years to come. The recognition was gratifying, but it also came with increased political pressure and public scrutiny that complicated her ability to focus on the technical and operational aspects of emergency management that she found most interesting and rewarding. As Rachel reflected on her journey from Springfield Valley to the corridors of federal power, she recognized that success in Washington required skills and perspectives quite different from those that had made her an effective nurse and local administrator. The ability to build coalitions among competing interests, to communicate complex technical information to non-expert audiences, and to maintain focus on long-term goals despite short-term political pressures had become as important as medical knowledge and emergency response experience. But the core values that had guided Rachel throughout her career remained unchanged. The belief that emergency medical systems should serve the people who depend on them, that coordination and communication could prevent unnecessary deaths, and that practical experience should inform policy decisions. Her federal position had given her the opportunity to apply these values on a national scale, touching millions of lives rather than the thousands she had served in Springfield Valley. The transformation from local emergency medical services director to federal policy leader had required Rachel to develop new capabilities and adapt to unfamiliar environments, but it had also demonstrated the potential for individual leadership to create systemic change. The programs she had developed and implemented were now being adopted by other countries, and the principles she had championed were influencing emergency medical education and training around the world. 5 years had passed since Rachel Torres first stepped into the federal building in Washington, D.C., and the landscape of emergency medical services across America bore little resemblance to what she had inherited. The communication protocols she had championed were now standard operating procedure in all 50 states, while her training programs had graduated over 50,000 emergency medical professionals who carried her philosophy of coordinated care into communities from Alaska to Florida. The earthquake response that had validated her approach had become a case study taught in emergency management programs worldwide, demonstrating how effective leadership could transform complex systems even within the constraints of federal bureaucracy. But success at the federal level had come with personal costs that Rachel was only beginning to fully understand. The relentless travel schedule, the pressure of congressional oversight, and the constant need to balance competing political interests had taken their toll on her health and relationships. She had gained weight, developed chronic insomnia, and found herself increasingly isolated from the hands-on medical work that had originally motivated her career choice. The recognition and professional achievement were gratifying, but they felt hollow without the direct human connection that had made nursing so fulfilling. The realization that something fundamental was missing from her life crystallized during a routine briefing about budget allocations for the coming fiscal year. As she listened to staffers discuss millions of dollars in funding as abstract numbers on spreadsheets, Rachel found herself thinking about specific patients she had treated during her nursing career. She remembered the weight of David Park's unconscious body as she performed CPR in the driver's seat of that school bus, the relief in his eyes when he regained consciousness, and the gratitude of 30 frightened children who had witnessed her determination to save their driver's life. The contrast between those visceral memories and the sterile environment of federal administration prompted Rachel to begin questioning whether her current position was truly the best use of her talents and experience. She had accomplished everything she had set out to achieve in Washington, creating systems and programs that would continue improving emergency medical care long after she moved on to other challenges. Perhaps the time had come to return to the more direct forms of service that had originally drawn her to healthcare. The decision to leave federal service wasn't made lightly or quickly. Rachel spent months discussing her options with mentors, colleagues, and family members who helped her think through the implications of walking away from a position that most people would consider the pinnacle of success in emergency management. The salary, prestige, and influence that came with her federal role would be difficult to replace, and she worried about whether she would regret abandoning the platform that allowed her to affect policy at the highest levels of government. But as Rachel reflected on her career trajectory, she recognized a pattern of growth that had consistently moved her toward greater challenges and broader impact. Her transition from staff nurse to emergency services director had required her to develop new skills while maintaining connection to patient care. Her move from local administration to federal policy had demanded even greater adaptation, but it had also distanced her from the direct service that provided her deepest sense of purpose. The path forward became clearer during a visit to Springfield Valley, where Rachel had been invited to speak at the dedication of a new emergency medical training center that bore her name. Walking through the facility where future paramedics and emergency medical technicians would learn the skills and values she had championed, Rachel felt more energized and purposeful than she had experienced in months of Washington meetings. The training center represented something more significant than just another educational facility. It embodied the principle that effective emergency medical care required not just technical competence, but also the kind of moral courage and collaborative spirit that Rachel had demonstrated during that October morning when she ran toward a runaway school bus instead of seeking safety. The instructors who would teach in the facility had been trained in her methods, and they would pass those lessons on to thousands of students who would carry her influence into communities across the region. During her visit to Springfield Valley, Rachel also spent time with some of the children who had been on David Park's bus during the incident that had launched her national career. Sophie Williams was now 19 years old and completing her first year of nursing school, inspired by Rachel's example to pursue a career in healthcare. Several of her former classmates had chosen similar paths, with some studying to become paramedics, emergency medical technicians, or hospital administrators. The ripple effects of Rachel's split-second decision to intervene in that crisis had produced a generation of young adults who understood the importance of courage, service, and quick thinking in emergency situations. Sophie told Rachel that her cohort of nursing students had become known among their instructors for their exceptional teamwork and their willingness to take initiative during clinical rotations. They approached patient care with a sense of purpose and responsibility that reflected the lessons they had learned from witnessing adult heroism during a formative moment in their childhood. Conversations with these young adults helped Rachel understand that her legacy wouldn't be measured solely by the federal programs she had created or the policy changes she had implemented. The most important impact of her career might be found in the individuals she had inspired to pursue careers in service, and in the values she had modeled for people who would spend their working lives helping others during moments of crisis and vulnerability. This realization influenced Rachel's decision about what to do next. Instead of seeking another high-profile federal position, or accepting offers from private consulting firms that wanted to capitalize on her reputation, Rachel chose to return to direct service in a way that would allow her to mentor the next generation of emergency medical professionals. She accepted a position as Director of Emergency Medical Education at a consortium of medical schools and nursing programs that served several southeastern states. The new role represented a significant reduction in salary and public profile compared to her federal position, but it offered something that Washington had been unable to provide: daily connection to the people who would be carrying on her work in communities across the country. Instead of writing policy papers and attending congressional hearings, Rachel would be designing curricula, teaching classes, and working directly with students who shared her commitment to saving lives through excellent emergency medical care. The transition back to educational work felt like a homecoming in ways Rachel hadn't anticipated. The energy and idealism of nursing and medical students reminded her of her own early career, when every patient interaction had felt like an opportunity to make a meaningful difference in someone's life. The students brought fresh perspectives and challenging questions that forced Rachel to articulate and refine the principles that had guided her career, helping her understand her own experiences more clearly. Rachel's first major initiative in her educational role was developing a new type of clinical rotation that would expose students to the kind of interagency coordination and emergency response that had become her specialty. Instead of limiting their training to single hospital departments, students would spend time with paramedic crews, emergency room teams, disaster response organizations, and public health agencies, learning how different parts of the emergency medical system worked together to serve communities. The integrated clinical rotations produced students who graduated with a much broader understanding of emergency medical care than previous generations of healthcare workers. They understood not just their own roles, but also how their work fit into larger systems and how effective collaboration could improve outcomes for patients and communities. Hospital administrators and emergency services directors began specifically requesting graduates from Rachel's program, recognizing their superior preparation for the complex realities of modern healthcare. Word of the program's success spread throughout the emergency medical education community, attracting visitors from other regions who wanted to learn from Rachel's innovative approach. She found herself once again traveling and speaking at conferences, but now the focus was on sharing educational methods rather than promoting policy changes. The work felt more fulfilling because it was directly connected to the preparation of individuals who would be providing patient care rather than managing abstract systems and budgets. One of the most rewarding aspects of Rachel's educational work was the opportunity to stay connected with her graduates as they began their careers. She received regular updates from former students who were applying the principles they had learned in her program to challenges in their own communities. Some were implementing coordination improvements in their emergency departments, while others were developing innovative training programs for rural emergency medical services that lacked resources for traditional education approaches. The network of professionals who had been influenced by Rachel's teaching began to create its own momentum for improvement in emergency medical care. Her former students were becoming leaders in their own organizations, carrying forward the values of collaboration, innovation, and patient-centered care that had defined Rachel's career. The multiplication effect of education was producing changes that extended far beyond what Rachel could have accomplished through individual effort, even at the federal level. During her third year in the educational role, Rachel was approached by a publisher who wanted her to write a book about leadership in emergency medical services. The project appealed to her because it would provide an opportunity to document the lessons she had learned throughout her career and share them with a broader audience of current and future healthcare professionals. Writing the book also forced Rachel to reflect systematically on her experiences and identify the patterns and principles that could be useful to others facing similar challenges. The book, titled Courage Under Pressure: Lessons from a Career in Emergency Medical Services, became a bestseller among healthcare professionals and emergency management specialists. Rachel's honest discussion of her failures and uncertainties, combined with practical advice about leadership and decision-making under pressure, resonated with readers who were dealing with similar challenges in their own careers. The book's success led to additional speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that allowed Rachel to influence emergency medical education and practice on a national scale, while maintaining her primary focus on direct teaching and mentoring. As Rachel approached her 60th birthday, she began to contemplate the next phase of her career and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. The federal programs she had created were now fully institutionalized and continuing to evolve under new leadership. The educational innovations she had developed were being adopted by other institutions and adapted to local needs and circumstances. Most importantly, the thousands of students she had taught and mentored were becoming leaders in their own right, carrying forward her values and approaches in communities across the country. The measure of Rachel's impact could be seen not just in policy changes or institutional improvements, but in the countless individual moments when well-trained emergency medical professionals made critical decisions that saved lives and reduced suffering. Every time a paramedic used the communication protocols she had developed to coordinate with a hospital emergency department, every time a nurse applied the collaborative principles she had taught to improve patient care, every time an emergency medical technician demonstrated the kind of moral courage she had modeled, Rachel's influence was being felt in ways that were impossible to quantify but profoundly meaningful. The recognition that her career had produced ripple effects extending far beyond her direct actions provided Rachel with a deep sense of satisfaction and completion. She had begun her professional life as a staff nurse focused on individual patient care, and she had evolved through various leadership roles that allowed her to affect larger numbers of people and more complex systems. But throughout that journey, the core motivation had remained constant: the desire to help people during their most vulnerable moments and to create conditions that would allow others to provide excellent care. Looking back on the incident that had transformed her life, Rachel understood that her decision to run toward David Park's bus rather than away from it had been the product of values and training that had developed over many years of healthcare work. The split-second choice to intervene had been important, but it was the sustained commitment to learning, growing, and serving others that had enabled her to make the most of the opportunities that followed. The real heroism wasn't in a single moment of courage, but in the daily choices to keep improving and to keep serving, even when the work was difficult or thankless. As Rachel considered her future plans, she remained committed to the principle that had guided her entire career, the belief that individuals could make meaningful differences in complex systems through persistence, collaboration, and unwavering focus on serving others. Whether through continued teaching, writing, consulting, or some combination of activities, she intended to keep contributing to the field of emergency medical services as long as her health and energy permitted. The legacy Rachel hoped to leave behind wasn't primarily about specific achievements or recognition, but about the example she had set for approaching challenges with courage, integrity, and compassion. She wanted to be remembered as someone who had demonstrated that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they committed themselves to serving others and refused to be discouraged by obstacles or setbacks. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.